If I had to bet, I would assume that many of you know the exact phrase or term that you would use that would just like set your parents off. Like, I'm talking about the type of thing that makes your parents go from having a rational conversation with you to immediate grounding. Like, here's how that played out for me. Growing up, my parents had a rule. We weren't allowed to spend the night on Saturday nights. And their rationale was, as a family, we go to church together. So we don't want you staying up super late the night before and being super tired, and we don't want you to miss. And so we're just not going to spend the night or have people spend the night on Saturday nights. I didn't like that rule, right? And so my friends would ask me, hey, Kyle, can you spend the night on Saturday? And I would go and I would talk to my parents, and every single time I would present it to them and they would say no. And we would go back and forth having this conversation. I couldn't just take no for an answer. And so this conversation usually lasted a really long time. My parents being patient, me whining. But it would eventually come to the point where I'm like, man, I'm not winning this thing. Like, this is not going well for me. And so I would use this line, and I call it the trigger line, because it was the one thing that my parents just like, man, it ended the conversation. And I would look at them and I would be like, but Mom, Dad, John's parents let him spend the night on Saturday nights. And that was it. Like, no more talking, conversation over. They'd be like, Kyle, go to your room right now. Get out of our face. Stop talking to us about this. And that was it. I mean, I'm sure you've used that same line, Mom, Dad, this person gets to do this. Why can't I? And maybe your parents didn't respond the exact same way as my parents would, but that would just set my parents off. And not one time did it ever work. Like, not one time were my parents like, oh, are you serious, Kyle? John's parents let him do that? You're right, you can do this. No, in fact, oftentimes it was way worse for me to use that, and yet I still did. And so just why do you think? Why do you think we use things like that? Why do you think I use things like that time and time again when it really never helped? I think for me, and I can only evaluate myself here, but I think for me, it was one of the earliest signs of something much deeper that had begun to grow in my heart. Something that I would begin to eventually use as like a worldview. Like, I began to perceive everything through these lenses. And that was the lens of comparison. So what I was doing when I said, man, John's parents get to do this, is I was comparing what John got to do to what I got to do. I was comparing my parents to John's parents, what my parents would let me do and what John's parents would let him do. It became a point of comparison. You might say, Kyle, that's just something that kids do in order to get what they want. But listen, for me, it became something so much deeper. I began to compare everything. Everything became a point of comparison. The way that I look, man, I don't look a certain way as this person looks. Man, I don't act a certain way as this person acts. I don't do the things that this person does. I'm not as smart as this person. And everything in my life became a point of comparison. And I know, students, I know that this isn't just a me problem. Students, like, statistically, what we're learning is that comparison and depression often go hand in hand. So whether we compare and then we become depressed, or we're depressed so then we compare, it doesn't really matter. Since 2008, depression in the lives of young people has increased over 52%. Students, this is crushing us. The path of comparison is a dangerous path that we need to be careful and we need to think clearly about. This isn't just a problem, students. I really believe that this is an epidemic, and many of us are battling with it and struggling with it. So why do we do this? Why do we fall into the trap of comparison? Because we know it's not going to help us. But guess what? I get it. Because, man, I've struggled with those things. I've struggled with self-image. I've struggled with social anxiety. I've struggled with the fear of not amounting to much or being alone. Man, I've struggled with these things. And oftentimes I looked out and I began to compare, and I know that it doesn't help. Like, I know that as I compare my life to my friends, it's just going to be this never-ending cycle where I'm just left hurting and wanting more. So why do we do it then? Because I really don't believe the answer is that complex. It's actually a very simple answer. The reason we compare is because we're searching for happiness. Like, when I compared my life to my friend John's life, I was doing that because I believed the fact that John got to do that, he got to spend the night on Saturday nights, that was making him happy. And I'm not happy because I don't get that. And that problem just became more and more evident in my life as I got older, right? I am not happy because I don't look a certain way, or I am not happy because I do not have. You can fill in the blank with whatever it might be. And students, I believe that many of us are probably walking down that similar path. We compare because we're in search of happiness. And it's an epidemic. It's a problem that's just crushing us and dominating the culture that we live in. And as students, I think we're exposed to it even more. If there was someone in the Bible who I'd say, man, they had a reason to compare, it would be the Apostle Paul. Like the Apostle Paul knew what it was like to experience mental, emotional, and physical pain. Like Paul knew what it was like to be rejected by men, by his friends. Paul knew what it was like to experience true starvation. Not just like, man, it's 4 o'clock and I'm getting hungry, and so I tell my parents, Mom, I'm starving. No, he actually was starving. He knew what it was like to be shipwrecked, right? We've never experienced that. He knew what it was like to be thrown into prison for what he believed. He knew what it was like to be tortured, beat, stoned. Paul knew what it meant to suffer. And so if there was anyone, and I say all this just to say, if there was anyone who could look around the room and point fingers, man, I wish I had that person's life, or man, I struggle with this and this person doesn't, or this is my story, or it would be the Apostle Paul. If anyone could compare, it would be him. He could walk down that path so much quicker and so much easier than many of us, but he doesn't do that. And in fact, in Philippians chapter 4, he tells us the reason why he doesn't do that is because he has found the secret to contentment, the secret to happiness, the secret to true joy. And man, I love how he uses that word secret. He says, man, I found the secret. It's like we're all searching for this. This is something that we all want and we're all searching for. And he's going to tell us where we can find it. So if you have your Bibles, open to Philippians chapter 4. And while you're doing there, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in Paul's life. So Paul writes the book of Philippians to the church at Philippi. Paul's in prison. So already we can see, man, Paul's not doing well. Like he's in prison. And this isn't just like, man, okay, I know I'm getting out of jail on Thursday. No, this is the type of jail where Paul's like, I don't know if I'm ever getting out of here, so I'm going to write a letter to my friends, encouraging them. Paul doesn't know if he was ever going to make it out of this prison. And so this letter to the Philippian church is like a death letter, man. He's writing to them saying, like, here's the last things I want you to know. Like as a teacher, here's my heart. Here's my care. It's going to you. And so Philippians chapter 4, we read this, starting in verse 10. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. So here's what we just read. Paul's in prison, right? And the church at Philippi, man, they've been caring for him. They've wanted to come to him, but they couldn't. They didn't have time. They were busy. And Paul knows that, but he begins to receive word. He begins to hear from the Philippian people that, man, Paul, we're praying for you. We're concerned about you. How are you doing? And Paul's heart is filled with joy. And I think many of us understand that. Like many of us understand that concept. Like when I'm having a bad day, it means a lot when someone just comes up, puts their arm around me and says, Kyle, you doing okay? And in fact, on like super difficult days, when I'm really having a bad day, I might try to like egg it on a little bit. I might try to make sure people notice that I'm having a bad day. Maybe I'm staring off into the distance a little bit longer, looking as sad as I possibly can, or I'm sighing a little bit longer. I'm isolating myself so that someone will come up and maybe someone will take notice that I'm hurting and having a bad day, and they'll come up and ask me. Like that fills my heart with joy. But guess what? Students, Paul's not doing that for that reason. He clarifies. He's like, I'm rejoicing in the fact that you're concerned with me, but not because I'm in need. Look at verse 11 again. He says, I am rejoicing, but not that I am speaking of being in need. For I have learned in whatever situation I am able to be content. Verse 12, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound in every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. So Paul again tells him, I don't need you to be concerned for me in order for me to find happiness or contentment. I don't need that because I've found the secret. And anytime anyone uses that word secret as someone who's struggled with comparison before, as they dangle that type of information out over me, I'm like chomping at the bit because I need that, because I've experienced the pain that comes from the path of comparison. So Paul, what's the secret? Man, if you don't need other people, if you don't need to look out, man, he's saying, Church of Philippi, I don't need to look out at you. I don't need it. I'm rejoicing in the fact that you're concerned for me, but that's not the root of my contentment. That's not the root of my happiness. So Paul, what's the answer? What's the secret? Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, he says this, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And you've probably heard that verse before. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It's pretty prominent in our culture. You've probably seen it on the side of maybe like Steph Curry's shoes. He's got it written there. I can do all things through Christ. Or maybe you've seen it on a pillow in someone's house. The point is, we know this verse. Now that's a good thing and a bad thing, because there's a good thing because you know the Bible, a bad thing because a lot of times we isolate this verse from its original context. Like we use this verse to mean something different than what Paul intended this verse to mean. See, when we use this verse, typically what we're doing is we're referring to some type of personal achievement. Like through Christ, I can score the winning goal. Through Christ, I can pass the test that I need to pass. Through Christ, I can achieve whatever I need to achieve. As long as I pray, I'm a Christian, as long as I do it in his strength and not my own, I can achieve whatever I need to achieve. But that's not what this verse is saying. In fact, when we isolate this verse from the context of what it was originally written in, this verse really has no power. It means nothing because it doesn't have to do with personal achievement. In fact, remember, what is Paul saying? What is Paul talking about? I can do all things through Christ. What is he referring to? I mean, he's referring to the secret. He's referring to the secret of how you find happiness, how you find contentment. And he's like, it doesn't come through the path of comparison. In fact, the secret to true happiness comes through Christ. So when Paul says, I can do all things through Christ, what he's saying is, I can endure all situations and find contentment because of Christ. Now, students, what does someone who lived 2,000 years ago really have to do with your happiness and your contentment? How does someone who lived 2,000 years ago really change things for us? Paul says, man, it changes things for me because it's the only constant. It's the only thing that doesn't change. My life has its ups and downs. He does that compare and contrast. I know how to be brought low. I know how to live high. I know how to do the good and the bad. I've experienced it all. And he says, man, the only thing that doesn't change for me is Christ. The person and work of Jesus Christ upon the cross, when he stretches his arms out, he gives this eternal picture of his love for you. Right? And so Paul says, man, those things that could be a point of comparison, God didn't even consider them as wondering, man, should I love this person or not? Right? So if you've struggled with self-image, man, and maybe there's something about yourself that you don't like, when Christ stretches his arms out of the cross, as a believer, not one time does he look at you and consider, man, should I love this person because they look this way? No, he loves you despite that. The cross is an eternal picture, a constant picture of God's love for you. He says you don't need to go down the road of comparison in order to find happiness. You need to run to the cross because true joy, true love, true acceptance is rooted there. It has nothing to do with what you might think is bringing other people happy. That will never bring you happiness. Students, it's the gospel that changes everything. You don't have to walk down the road of comparison when you lean into the gospel, when you lean into the cross, because your purpose, your intentions, the things that matter shift and begin to change because you realize that, man, God looks at you and he loves you. And that never changes. That's the constant. Students, if you don't know Jesus, let me tell you, that's available for you. You don't need to walk down this road of comparison or feeling like you don't measure up because in Christ, there is an eternal love. Students, many of us are walking with the lenses of comparison on. Everything in our life becomes a point of comparison. We begin to evaluate everything, and we talked about that today. Students, let me tell you, in Christ, you find not just freedom from that, but true love, true acceptance, true purpose. Oftentimes when we go down the path of comparison, what we're really doing is we're walking down the path of rebellion. Like it causes us to compromise on our values, compromise on things that we know are right and true. Students, Jesus is enough. Run to the cross. Don't run to the thoughts of, man, what this person has or this person has. That will never bring you true, lasting happiness. To find contentment in the midst of your suffering, you run to the gospel.